Well, welcome everyone to our presentation on how to make coniferous trees. I think Pat just referred to Nutrax. He's been involved with that organization of impromptu modelers, providing an alternative way to bring us all together and keep learning. And it was through our presentation on Nutrax that someone from your division found us. But we're happy to present this again to all of you. Pat and I are in Ontario, Canada. We're both members of the Western Ontario division of the NMRA, and it's through our involvement in that part of our organization that we came to know each other. We live a considerable number of miles or kilometers apart, but it's really a sort of a good example, again, I guess, of one of the payoffs of being involved in the NMRA, and certainly involved in your local division, that we have come to get to know each other and collaborate on a number of things, and this just being one of them. When it comes to making trees, it really doesn't matter whether you're talking deciduous or coniferous from our point of view. I think our main lesson for each other, and that certainly we emphasize with others, is whether you're modeling trees or doing lots of other things in terms of scenery or buildings for that matter, it really pays to look at the real world. And in the case of trying to model trees, looking at nature, we like to observe, but also because the memory will fool. It's great to take photos, and as you'll see in a moment, there's lots of great resources on the internet as well, because a lot of us model scenes that are some distance from our home, and in Pat's case, it's halfway across the continent. We are, of course, talking about coniferous trees, and specifically for Pat's layout, the pictures that we've assembled are taken in British Columbia, which is about 4,000 kilometers. So I guess it's around 2,000 miles, more or less, from where we reside. And so periodic trips out to British Columbia, but also lots of resources on the internet help to give a good, strong reference when starting the modeling process. And I'm not sure what has just happened, but all right, let me try again. All right. Here's one shot from one of Pat's trips to British Columbia, and you can see immediately in the foreground just the variety of species, the shapes of the trees, the different branch structures that we'll be referring to on a number of occasions. Notice as well the low foliage. Some of it might be juniper, which is low growing in alpine-like settings, but also could be small seedlings trying to take off. Here again, another scene, this time down the side of the mountain into a gorge, and emphasizes that coniferous trees in particular are usually the first large structures to get established in a lot of environments on this planet, and will often thrive in very seemingly inhospitable, if not gravity challenging locations. Here again, another environment which probably on first look you think, wow, that's really nice near a water source, but anyone who's ever visited any kind of a mountain gorge anywhere in the world knows the kind of winds that get whipped up, partly by the falling water from the waterfall, but lots of other conditions. So again, can be very, very harsh and can affect the way the trees grow. This particular shot we like because it emphasizes something I think we often overlook. I know that if I cast my memory back to when I was drawing trees in public school, I probably uniformly colored them all brown. But when in fact you go out into nature and you look hard with adult eyes, you begin to realize that rarely, if ever, are tree trunks brown. And in fact, if anything else, they're kind of a grayish color. So this one's almost silver to my eye, and you'll notice the nice bark pattern coming down it. But two other things here to point out that again we'll talk about as we get into the actual modeling. Notice in the upper area, and there's my cursor, you'll notice that there's lots of branches, orphan branches, dead branches that a lot of coniferous trees in particular will have. So we often tend up to see articles and modelers who are modeling all different kinds of needle structure, but overlook the fact that most mature trees will have a lot of this kind of dead, gnarly looking growth underneath. The second thing that pops out for me in this particular picture is look at what happens when these branches drop off. Number one, there's what causes knots in wood, but as well, when the break off for the branch is fairly fresh, you're going to get, in this case, coniferous like pine tar flowing down the outside until it scabs over, like this particular detachment. And as long as it's weeping tar, that tends to pick up all sorts of dirt and things. So if you've got a tree in the foreground that's going to get a lot of attention from viewers down the aisle, this is another area of detail that we can add as we get to the finishing touches on our model trees. So in the next couple of pictures, we're going to show sort of an overview of what ultimately I think every modeler is wanting to work toward, and that is a good scenic area with lots of trees. And in this case, again, the focus is on deciduous trees in Pat's O-scale layout. I should mention, by the way, that I model an HO. So the techniques that we're talking about here work in both scales fairly well. So here's one scene from Pat's layout. The backdrop to this, the main town that's shown on his layout, you get a real idea again of trying to replicate the vertical rock formations that characterize the Rocky Mountains, and then the variety of different types of trees that he has simulated using all different kinds of material. And again, very rarely are coniferous forests uniformly conifers. So there are a few, probably, I think I'm right here, Pat, these are ash trees that you've plopped in a couple of spots.
Mountain ash.
Mountain ash.
Yeah.
And you'll note the low growth as well.
Yep.
Yeah, so there's a good mix in this scene, and that really reflects, as you'll see, different kinds of material, different techniques, as well as some commercial interspersed with homemade. Another scene somewhat similar, and we'll see this in close-up again later when we start looking at the placement of trees. But again, right away you can see the trunk structure and detailing is very, very similar to that last natural picture that we had. In terms of sourcing material, I said that there's certainly lots of things that we can find on the internet. Certainly photographs are there, but just searching in Google for coniferous trees and then comma silhouette will produce a wide range of this kind of artwork. So if you use the image subset rather than the all search, you'll just get these kinds of resource materials coming up. And the really great news about this, of course, is for the technique that we're talking about in this clinic, it can be used in a variety of places in this world because coniferous trees are everywhere. So these are North America, these particular ones, as well as these. And as you look at these, note the branch structures, notice the overall shape of the trees. Within any one species, rarely are two trees the same, but this just illustrates this and the previous, the wide variety within the species and how in some cases almost very uniquely each species or subspecies within the family of conifer has. Here again, some other ones. These from Europe, Northern Europe, Scandinavia. And I think if I recall correctly, these are from, some of these at least are from Australia as well. So like I say, you can pretty much find conifer trees on, or shrubs on every continent of the world. So Pat, would you take over and talk about, start to talk about the actual modeling technique?
Thank you, Paul. Just here picture, you'll see some of the tools that I use to do the trees. We're going to do a list here. There's from the left, I use sandpaper. Then I have the a scroll saw blade, and a regular knife on the side there. You can buy, it has replaceable blades on the end. You just snip off break off what you want to keep it sharp. Then you'll see here, there's also a sponge type sandpaper, and a brush to clean up the mess. And you'll see two different brushes there that I use for the painting. One's a soft, fairly soft yellow handled brush, and just a regular type brush. And the next one has got a flared end and fairly stiff. Then on the right side there, you'll see that little tool next to the balsa wood is my graining tool. And then I'll explain that tool later on. And your dish, or your, not your dish, but your container at the top left-hand side, you'll see the paint that I use to paint the trunks of the tree. It's a mixture of two different colors, red and black, or brown, brownish and black. Then the wood I use, I like to use balsa wood. So you'll see the different types of stages that we're going to use the balsa wood in, as the raw balsa on the left. And then you'll see the shaping of the balsa wood on the second picture there, number 2, which is, I don't try to make it vertically straight. I just do it roughly, and you'll see that later on I can do a better job with the graining tool. Then we'll show you how to sand it, then we'll show you how to paint it, and then place the branches on. Here is a close-up of the raw balsa. In O scale, I like to use 1/2 inch or larger, sometimes smaller, just to do the smaller trees, but mostly 1/2 inch and up. And in HO scale, you could do about half that size, or 3/8 inch. But there is no standard size in tree trunks. It's usually a large trunk, and it can be small trunks. It all depends what you want to use. Smaller N scale ones, well, definitely you're going to have a challenge, but it can be done. Trust me.
For HO, I also use dowel that you can get at a lot of hobby stores, and in some cases for smaller trees, I'll also use skewers.
Yep.
Just kebab skewers.
Mm-hmm. Here you see how I start shaping the balsa wood from the square. You want to carve down the balsa to a point-like shape, maybe, and then you carve away from you. Of course, that's a safety way of doing things. Don't do it as I show you, but do it the safe way. And then you use your graining tool afterwards to shape the trunk even better. I use the graining tool to do a lot of the work. That graining tool, we'll see it later on. I'll explain to you where it comes from and what it is. That graining tool is used in flower arranging. They use that tool to put the stems in from the flowers and hold it up in the vase. So if you're wondering what it's all about, that's what it is. And you can see how I use it to carve the trunk. And I think if you take that graining tool and place your wood, it should be placed on that there to show you the effect of the graining tool on the wood. The thing is to put it on the wood on a flat surface and run the graining tool across the top of it. But
so the opposite of what we've actually shown in the picture.
Yeah, exactly.
This way is almost a surefire way to break the balsa.
Yeah, if you break it, it's easy to put it back together again. Just stick a toothpick or a dowel in the end of one piece and drill a hole in the other end and wood back together again. Nobody's going to know the difference. Hit it with the graining tool and it'll be just as good. Now you can use your razor saw instead of that graining tool to do the same thing, and it'll also be effective in N scale and HO, either way. Depends on how deep you want to make it. Then the grain. It's okay to have a crooked trunk too, and not always straight. I've seen a lot of them. they keep it straight, but I like to have it all shapes and sizes. Here I take a piece of sandpaper in stage 4 to sand off the real rough part of the trunk, and you'll see some of the rough pieces on the surface at the bottom. I just rough it off and sandpaper it. Don't want to take off too much because I like to leave the grain. If you take off too much, you'll take away the graining on it. Here you see what it looks like after the sandpaper is used. The trunk is ready for staining. And by the way, yeah, don't take off all of the roughness, because real trunk, you still see some of it. It's never really gone completely, and that's, just leave it like that. It'll look natural.
There'll be good stand-ins for those orphan branches that we were showing you in that very last picture taken in the forest, where you've got branches that are dead, still clinging to the tree.
Mm-hmm. You could also take, in that picture, you could also take a little drill and drill little holes here and there to represent those holes you saw in the trunk at the beginning. There's so many ways of doing it. Here you can see where I'm painting it. I use the black here at the first, and it's straight black. And you'll wonder, why would I use straight black? Well, I mix it with water and some of that brown paint to give it an effect, but also the paint settles into the grooves and highlights them. So when you let it absorb into it, it'll lighten up a lot. So you'll see in the next pictures that it does. Here we use the hairdryer on it just to speed up the process, and you'll see how it's lightened up at the bottom right-hand side of that trunk we did. And you'll still see some of the fuzz that's still on there. Looks quite natural, but it does lighten up quite a bit. You do want a variation in the color. In this picture, you'll see where I added the white paint in a small metal container that's used for painting with. You want to use a paintbrush that I showed you, that flared one. I put it in the paint, and I do a dry brushing effect on the trunk of the tree. And you want to do it across the grain. Don't do it with the grain, otherwise you'll fill in all that deep grain pattern that is right there right now in the black. And you can use paper towel to wipe off the white paint and to do your dry brushing. Here you can see the results of the trunk after it's been done with the colored texture to the balsa. You'll see how that black paint, it just highlights in the grain in it, and you can see some of the balsa coming through it too. So it looks great natural, at least I think anyway. Okay, this is a stage process that I like to use. This is Doc O'Brien's Mildew Green. I like to use that. You could use others too, but I find it just gives a better effect on the O scale for moss growing on the side of the tree trunk. You'll never see a tree trunk that's completely clean of just the trunk color. But I put it on, and I usually just brush it on a little bit when the paint's still a little bit wet in certain areas. And it'll simulate the trunk. And poly fiber is another thing you can use for the tufts, and ground foam also. And like on the north side of the tree, you'll get more moss than on the other side. And that's usually the way it grows, because it's the most moistest area in the tree area that is growing.
Working in HO, I'll sometimes simulate the moss on a tree. I've got some of the old Floquil paints, and I'll dry brush one of the darker greens very, very sparingly down, as Pat was saying a moment ago, down the one side of a trunk. And this is the sort of thing where I'm paying more attention for something that's going to be either at the foreground of a stand of trees, or a tree that's going to get perhaps more visibility, because it's toward the aisle side of the layout.
You can see the finished bark effect here is quite different. Every tree is different. No tree is the same, and you don't have to have it perfectly smooth. Don't panic if it raises the fibers. It's all natural, and you can see the hint of the moss on the tree itself. Remember to plant that tree, all of the ones with the moss on, facing the same direction. That would represent the north side of the tree.
And I know that you and I tend to work through these in batches. About how many trunks would you do at a time?
I would try to do at least 10 or 12 trunks at a time, because by the time you get done painting and finishing the trunk, the other one at the first is dry, you can go back and start doing the rest of the dry brushing on it. And then from there you can add the moss. Each end of the list of the trees that you have trunks, it works out pretty good. I usually do about 10 or 12. You can do as many as you want.
And I'll take a similar approach. I'll often plant trunks, both coniferous and deciduous, into a piece of foam packing material that I've gotten from something that's come in that's electronic or appliance, and we'll then work on them in a batch way. So I think most modelers who are experienced tend to find that that's a great way to approach something that has a variety of steps and stages like this.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly once we're happy with the trunk, it's now to move on to getting it ready for the planting, which is what we're doing here. And then from there, we'll be working on the branch structure itself. So using a Dremel or hand drill of some form, certainly with the larger format O scale, Pat will use a skewer in the bottom of his trunk material. I'm working usually with one of those double-ended round toothpicks or a piece of wire for HO scale, just because obviously the trunks are going to be a lot smaller, but the idea is the same. Give yourself something that's going to help the tree to be stable once you get it into whatever is your sub-road bed or sub-scenery material.
A little trick here I want to put in, Paul.
Excuse me, Pat?
If you drill a hole for that skewer stick, I've used hot melt glue gun, and it seems to work quickly and it holds it in the position you want it in. That's what
smaller scale. I use white glue to set it, and I've got a couple of glues that work very nicely with dissimilar materials. If it's wire, then I'm pushing into the bottom. And canopy glue, of course, is another one that's really great for that as well. Okay, so we've now got our trunk armatures as it is ready. So it's really a question of what kind of species are we going to model. So back to the photographs, back to the silhouettes, back to the environment that the scene that your model railroad is set in to determine what are the dominant species in that area. Armed with that knowledge then, and something to follow along with, choose one of a number of different types of armatures for the branches themselves. In this case, we're going to be using Caspia. Caspia, you can see in the lower right-hand side, ideally when you obtain them from a florist, and that would be probably your best source of this material. Different florists, of course, will regularly order in essentially what they call filler foliage. If you are buying a bouquet from a florist as opposed to picking one up in a supermarket, florists have a tendency to add in additional material just to make the bouquet look fuller. And we can exploit these other kinds of non-flower plants that they bring in. And if they don't, you can always ask your florist, do they have access through their distributor to Caspia? And if they do, then probably that's even better. They can order in the quantity that you're looking for, and you can get it reasonably fresh, and hopefully so that it hasn't been battered around too much. Because what you're looking for is as much of this structure that you see in the lower right here that I'm circling, these kind of little florets that are at the end of the branch structure. So we're going to be then dyeing them a green color generally. And here's a little tip, particularly if you don't think you're going to be doing tons and tons and tons of trees. How do you buy paint so that it's affordable? Well, one of the things to look for is the last decade or so, the paint industry has gotten into giving people that are decorating sample bottles. These are smaller than the pint or the liter cans that we would normally buy, and they're designed so that you can either take them as primary colors, or probably more frequently you can mix them with whatever formula you can get in a paint chip, and you can take that home and paint a small area. If you don't like the actual paint on the wall of your home, then you haven't laid out a large amount of money. Well, that size is perfect for us. I can't give you a price because particularly these days they're changing a lot. That's one of the things to inquire about when you go to a paint department. Do they have sample sizes of latex paint? And that's what we're referring to. Again, we're going to be mixing them 50-50 as we did with the trunk paint, and you're going to be adding in a bit of detergent. And we know, of course, but in case you're not familiar with the technique, water has a tension to it. We call it viscosity among the molecules. And the nice thing about detergent is if you put a couple of drops on it, you can watch it, particularly if there's already grease in your dishwater. You can watch how a couple of drops of detergent make the grease scatter to the edges. And that's that process of breaking down the tension in the water. And the nice thing that it does for us here is that when you've got water with a little bit of detergent in it, it helps it to penetrate more deeply into your material and give you a good thorough coverage when you're dipping it into your wide mouth jar, as we're showing here. You'll note the comment here to hang to dry. So you want to set up a line in advance, and good rule of thumb, put down lots of newspaper or absorbent material underneath. Failing to do that may result in you getting into hot water. Do we speak from experience? You be the judge. Once you've got it dried and colored, then you can start to break it down into smaller pieces. Remember, you want very small for the upper area of your tree and larger as you start going down it. So you start breaking off into a variety of different sizes. And then we take a drill. In this case, looks like Pat's using a battery Dremel style tool. And he's starting here at the very, very top of the tree, and he's going to be working down. And again, look at your pictures, look at the silhouette diagrams to determine whether the tree that you need to model for your area uses this exact kind of technique. Again, always take your cues from nature itself. So once we get the trees, branches at the top planted, either with hot glue or, again, I more frequently use white glue, you want to start your structure down the trunk itself. And this is where it's really, really important to look back at whatever diagrams or silhouettes or photographs you've got. Some coniferous trees, the branches almost starting at the top and all the way down have a tendency to curve upward. Others are more upward, and then as you get further down the tree, the main branches are sort of almost at right angles. And yet other trees, and certainly some of the spruces come to mind, those lower branches tend to droop right down and away. So what's going to be the clue to someone who's looking at your tree is that you are placing the branches for the type of species that you're trying to model in a way that's consistent with what they've come to expect, even though they may not even know the names of the trees. Their eye and their mind sort of says, this is what I think it should look like, and that's what we're going to try to duplicate. So if in the drilling of your holes down through the trunk, you inadvertently go out the other side, no problem. As Pat said, some could be knots, or where other branches have fallen off, but frequently they'll serve the purpose of just giving you an attachment point on the other side. That's the other thing to look at as well. As you're going down the trunk from the top and you're looking at the species that you're trying to duplicate, Note how the branches come off of the main trunk. Some trees, they alternate, so they may be let's say north, south, east, west. They may be at the same attachment point or the same plane. In others, it's almost a spiral shape as it goes down. In other cases, it's alternating, and they tend to be unique to different trees. Now, there are only so many different arrangements, but again, between the angle of the branch, the size and the structure of the branch, and how it's placed on the main trunk itself, those will all be visual cues to the person who's looking at what you've been doing to say, this is the type of tree that I would expect to find in that location. And as we note at the very, very bottom here, we have a list of some resources to help us in and beyond the internet. That'll be on the last slide of our presentation. So here's the start of Pat's work on this particular species. And help me, Pat, do you remember what you were trying to model when we were taking these pictures a couple of years ago?
Particularly more of a Douglas fir. And that's what I was going
Was this a Douglas fir?
Mostly Douglas fir, and there's not much spruce. It's mostly fir trees out there and cedar.
But this particular one, do you recall what we were doing that day?
In what way? You mean the type of tree?
What species of tree is this?
This is a fir, Douglas fir.
All right. So once we've got the shape of the branches in place, in this case, again, just a reminder, we're using Caspia around the balsa trunk. We're using hairspray, and the key here, don't use cheap hairspray and don't use scented by all means, or you'll end up, when you got a forest in place, you'll end up with some really strange odors, particularly in the summertime if you're in a humid part of the country. And the other thing is, it would seem intuitive at first thought, why wouldn't I use spray adhesive? And you could, but the advantage of hairspray is that it works well in terms of holding whatever material, whether it's ground foam or flocking that you're applying onto your armature, but it tends not to transfer to all the material that falls through and falls off of our tree as we're developing it. So whatever you catch, in this case in the white tub underneath where we're working, you can recycle it again and again. With spray adhesive like the 3M product, it just clumps up and it becomes impossible to reuse. So again, you just keep applying until you're happy with the end result. Yes, Pat.
One note here I'd like to say, I have some trees that I've used the hairspray on that are over 10 years old, especially some of the ones you see in the picture behind me, and they've been there for a long time, and they don't lose their foam or ground foam or whatever it is you're putting on them. So you can see they last a long time.
The other thing that you can do as well, I know it's a technique that some of us use with particularly foreground deciduous trees, is once you get the darker material on like this, you can, perhaps it's on your second or third iteration, you can hold the armature upward over, again, your catchment bucket, and take a slightly lighter color and just sprinkle a little bit so that it falls on the top side of your branch structure, and that will either duplicate newer growth or where the sunlight is hitting the tree. So a number of different ways that you can vary the look and enhance the detail. And there we are. In this case, we were using a ground foam on the Caspia. And you can see that, again, the branch structure specific for the particular species. If this was, or you turn your head sideways, you can see that the branch structure is decidedly downward, and that starts even at the very top of the tree. In the case of a fir tree like this, we're talking 60, 80 feet. So these are massive trees in the forest.
You also see some of the branches on there that are dead as well.
Yeah, yeah. Back to you, please.
Yeah, I always wanted to do a Scotch pine tree, which was, there are some out there. They're very difficult to do with the Caspia, so I looked for another species, which was German Sepia. It's a member of the same flowering item, but I found it at a florist, and if you ask for it, they could probably find it for you and get it for you. I usually take the German Sepia and I'll flock it before I put it on. It makes it a lot easier. Those branches are very, very stiff and harder to break than the Caspia. It's very light. I use a static grass, or I'll sprinkle on some flock to make it look thicker. And I'll keep the branch structure straight out more than sloped downward. If you look at a Scotch pine tree, their branches are straight out more. I found the like I said before, the armatures on Caspia do not stand up very well. And another thing I found that I liked about the Sepia was the fact that the branch structure is a lot more brown in color and a lot stronger. So when you put it into the tree trunk, it doesn't break off as easily. There's a picture of it there if you want to take a close up anytime.
So we're not saying that the Caspia is not a suitable material, but if your trees, depending on the species that you want to have on your layout, if you're going to be putting some trees in a reach-in area or close to where it's more likely to be bumped, you're probably going to have more casualties if you have a Caspia based tree as opposed to a German Sepia based tree.
Ask me how I know, because I've done it many times. Now, your alternative branch armatures. So we've been using live plants before this, and I'll give you a list here. The German Sepia I've used for the Scotch pine, but I also found a fern that was available at Hobby Lobby. It's a plastic fern. And I found that this worked out very well to do the tree structures on the trunk, tree limbs and branches. It's very durable, and it doesn't dry out like the other ones do. They will dry out eventually, but they don't break off unless you hit them. These here are very, very durable. Yeah, I've hit them. I put at the front of my layout, and I hit them many times, and they stand up a lot better than the others do. So Hobby Lobby is a U.S. firm, by the way. I used to spend a lot of time in that store, and that's how I found them. You can see the fern at the bottom. Now I'll take those ferns and I'll cut them off. In fact, at the end of the fern itself, you'll see a nub on there. That's stuck on a piece of wire that comes out of the plastic branch structure. And I just pull it off. Then I'll take that particular stem and I'll cut them off from the top to the bottom at different lengths. So don't worry how lousy that looks there. You're going to fill it up with material anyway. So, and they can be glued to the trunk in the same way as we do the other plants that we've used. Okay, now this is what I use. I hairspray them too, and I'll sprinkle on more flock. There is some flock on it when you buy these, and they're not a lot. And I found that as the years passed, they got cheaper on the flock. I think it got expensive for them or something, because I had to add more flock to make it look better. Then I'll respray it and I'll flock it again, and it keeps thickening up as I go, and it looks better as you go. You'll see. See that? A to B, quite a difference. Doesn't look as bad as it did when I first bought them. The ground foam has made a big difference in the flocking of the tree, as well as making it look better for applying to the trunk. I'll use this.
The flock, of course, more naturally simulates the needle structure, which
right.
Again would only show up really on the foreground.
That's right. That's right. And this one here, I used about the whole branch itself, because I'll place these at the bottom of the tree. and in B or A. Here's a new one that Paul found when wandering through Hobby Lobby when he was down south, and this one could be used. You could flock it a little bit, and it'll make it look pretty good when you get done. You'd have to experiment with it, and you'd have to use your scissors to cut off the different ones that you have on that branch. But it could be used very easily.
If you were to look in the upper left-hand close-up, you can see that the structure is perhaps a little bit different than the one that Pat first started to use out of Hobby Lobby. So these, I'm not really sure what to call them, but branches that come off of the main trunk. They're not popped into any sort of attachment point. So Pat was referring that you just have to cut them off. This central piece, I mean, if you could use it, particularly in O scale, like the one that Pat has relied on the most, that does have a wire core to it. So it is bendable and will to some extent retain its shape. But where we're really interested is this material off the side, which will ultimately, for some types of coniferous trees, simulate both the branch structure as well as the base of the sort of the branches that have the needles.
Yes, and we gave you the numbers for those. Now, Paul said he couldn't find the one that I had before, so I went online and I did find the numbers for the real one that I used before, and it's called Green Lace Fern. Green Lace Fern Spray, and then SQ number is 540641, if anybody's interested.
Why don't we put those numbers in the chat at the end of the presentation?
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, no problem. We'll move on. Here you'll see the plastic branches as they've been applied to the trunk of the tree. And in this particular tree, the modeling is redwood. And they usually have some pretty big branches on a redwood tree, as well as spaces in between them. If you look at a real redwood tree, you'll see that it looks close to what they have. And then I have some of the dead branches at the bottom of the right-hand picture. You'll see them sticking out there. Tell you the truth, I take some of those dead branches from the Caspia branches that are broke off. Works out pretty good.
That's one of the nice things about the larger scales is for those who have an artistic touch like Pat, you can just get a lot more detail in.
You can do it in HO too, but you have to take your time doing it, and it still looks pretty good. I take some of the scrap pieces and throw them around the bottom of the tree, and it helps represent dead branches and what have you. And the polyfiber you can see on the tree branches themselves, they look pretty good as well. And I'll use a hot glue gun to put branch or what you call root systems at the bottom of the tree. I'll squirt some of the hot glue on the bottom of the tree, and I'll kind of place it on there and spread it out. It makes a good base to paint to make it look like the branches coming off the bottom of the tree. I use that at the foreground. You could also use plumber's putty or something like that. I'm going to be experimenting later with the pieces of balsa and glue them to the side and work them out so they look like the large branch or the large rooting systems at the bottom of the tree for the foreground trees. You can do just about anything you want to make it look like roots at the bottom. Then you can also cover the bottom so you can't see the roots too.
So the sequence that we'll follow is with the finished tree, we'll drill a hole, we'll plant the tree, then add in any tree base or surround material, certainly the root structure, and then the litter and any sifted dirt can be applied at that point. One of the things that I've started using in the process of trying to simulate trunk material where it grows up through the ground away from the trunk itself, which some conifer trees tend to do. If you're not familiar with conifers, most of them tend to have a very shallow root structure, and some more than others will tend to send sort of tributary secondary roots up, and that will break the soil sometimes as much as 1 to 2 yards away from the tree, depending on its overall scale or size. I've got a farm field near my home, and I'll go out usually after the crop has come off. I'll get some dirt and sift it back in the house, and what I'm left with, or one of the things that I'm left with, is the remnants of the crop root, if not weed root, from the field. And once that dries up, again, little pieces of it cut, can be laid down and glued in place, and then kind of partially buried by all that other sort of ground litter and dirt that you're going to sift in place. And because it's going to be down in place on the layout, I'm not too worried about the fact that it is dry and brittle. It's more the visual appeal that I'm looking for. And it's got, again, an HO, the right kind of scale. So here's some other examples of what Pat's got in his layout. So here we've got a mix of commercially available tree and tree materials, and then some of the do-it-yourself kinds of trees that we've been demonstrating here in this clinic. And you get a sense, of the variety, of course, of the different species, using different kinds of armature material for the needle branches gives you a different look as well. There's not too much variety here in terms of the branches and how they're coming off of the trunk, but you'll see again in a moment, just again, some broader panorama shots where there is that kind of variety. Here's a number of different types of trees. So again, you can see the color variation. You can see the tree branch variation, a little bit of variation here in this particular picture as well. Pat, you were going to interject?
Yeah, for one thing, go back to the other picture, please, Paul.
Yep.
Bragdon Enterprises come out with a fern that looks very good on their fir trees, or their different trees that they make. I found that it works great, but the only problem with it, those things will dry out, and you have to spray them with a mixture of glycerin and water, or glycerin and alcohol, and you just keep them alive, or keep them subtle. If you don't, they'll dry right up and curl right up on you. That's what I found out.
Yeah, it would be glycerin and water. Alcohol tends to dry things out too much.
Yeah.
Problem with respraying with glycerin is, anybody who's done it would attest, is it can be pretty messy. So it's nice to do it on the first occasion. If I've done it in old kettle drums, soak material in a mixture of glycerin and water, but boy, I'll tell you, on the layout, you'd have to be a brave soul. Because
I usually put a piece of paper behind it, Paul.
Oh,
put a large piece of paper
drip.
on.
It's the drip.
I don't use very much.
Here's another nice panorama shot on Pat's layout. And again, we can see everything here from looks like lichen to other kinds of small materials standing in for fourth floor growth, ground cover, and small trees starting up to, you can just see the variety of texture here. And what I love personally about shots like this is you don't have to know your trees. You just look across this and it looks pretty realistic, and it looks, quite frankly, even better when you see it on the actual layout itself. I don't think this picture that I took actually does it justice.
I've added a lot more since then.
Yeah. Here again, another shot of the ridge line and the deciduous trees for a bit of texture and color difference. And again, not just done for artistic, but this is what we would find on site. Notice this tree here as well. This has got, for me, a lot of appeal. There's often a lot of deadwood in a stand of coniferous trees. Some parts of North America, much more so than others. I think of in parts of the province that we live in, north of the Great Lakes, Lake Superior, you'll drive through areas, and in some cases, perhaps because of swampy ground, marshy ground, half of the conifers that you'll see will be dead. So again, depends on the area that you're modeling. Look at nature carefully, take lots of photos, and then think about what you want your scene to look like back in your layout. But again, there's another way of modeling what is probably closer to real life. And of course, it takes a lot less work to have a tree that has died than one that's fully laden with foliage.
I haven't done a burnt one yet. That's something totally different.
But there's another one that we'll often see, and of course you'll see them in small clumps.
Yeah.
That final words from you?
I don't know. I think that modeling trees is like modeling on your layout. You got to do what you can as a I don't know, you got to be detailed. You can put as much work into a tree as you can, your layout work. And especially if you're putting it to the front of the layout, it's the first thing you're going to see. So when you're looking at your layout, it looks more natural to have the larger stuff in the front and the smaller stuff in the back. Another thing it does too, I find it's better to do it yourself and save yourself a little bit of money, because I started looking at the price of some of these beautiful trees that some of the dealers or some manufacturers do, and they're beautiful trees, and the prices represent the price of the making those type of trees. So this way, we hope we can show you how to obtain the quality and realism that you want to do as close as you can to those that are manufactured. It's a DIY article, and I hope it gives you the information that you can use to make your own set of trees for your layout. Give it a try, you'll have fun. It is really a lot of fun, and you can do it in front of your TV if you're watching a good football game, which we're missing today, I guess. Anyway, here's different sources. You can get Gordon Gravitt. He has Modeling Trees, Part 2, Wild Swan Publications. And then Identifying Trees, an all-season guide to Eastern North America, Williams Mike from the Stackpole Books, first edition, April 4th, 2007. The grading tool, as I said, is a flower arranging tool that you use to stick the plants in and hold it up straight in your vases. You can get this at Michael's, and you could probably get it from your own florist if you ask them, because they use it in the florists.
Also try Amazon.
Yeah. And Caspia, German Sepia, you can get it from your florist. Select the stocks that are full. And I don't know, you can pretty well do anything you want as long as you use a good hairspray that doesn't smell. If you don't want to smell like a beauty salon afterwards, buy good stuff. Don't buy the cheap stuff. I found out it doesn't hold.
And Pat, if you could add the SKU numbers that you obtained online this week from Hobby Lobby into the chat, people will have that as a resource if they want to follow up.
Mm-hmm.
That brings us to the end. Turn things back to you, Ernie, if people have any questions, and I'll stop the share from here.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Pat and Paul.
You're
very
welcome.
good clinic. A question was popped by one of our folks. Your one book there showed 1870. Is that the correct date, or I'm just asking?
Actually, Paul had got that information. You don't know any more about it, Paul?
Not off the top of my head, but it's easy enough. If I'm checking a book, I take information and I type it into the book section of Amazon.
Okay. All righty. That's the only thing I saw pop up on the chat. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? If so, feel free to unmute your mic and ask it.
I just want to thank you all for the great webinar.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It was fun.
Well, a lot of good information. I know that I thought cars was a little bit of a challenge, but making trees has always been a challenge for me. And seeing your clinic, and it's makes it look like it's maybe a little bit easier than I think. Maybe like building cars. I don't know. Once you get to it, I guess, and learn the techniques.
Well, and I think
A lot
what
of
I've
fun.
found, at least for trees that have high visibility, in this case conifer trees, it produces a more realistic approach than, I think the first technique I was introduced to some years ago is the floor pad or some form of a synthetic cleaning pad on a skewer. And that tends to be, even if you've cut up the edges, just the fact that they're discs stacked doesn't give you the kind of freedom as a modeler to simulate different kinds of species. It just gives you trees. It's kind of like that polyfoam pillow material puff. Good to fill out a slope, but not very realistic looking up close. So, you know, I think you choose your technique depending on how much return you're going to get on the effort. More effort in the foreground would be my rule of thumb.
Foreground trees do a good job of, you know, take your time adding the root system at the bottom, and it's just like anything you do in the hobby. If you take your time at it, it'll look good. And practice makes perfect too. I'm not perfect by any means.
One of the comments that Pat made in the close is how you set the scene and what the visitor to your layout sees. A lot of us don't build with that in mind. I certainly didn't, but I can say that it's been quite a number of times that I've gotten down to where Pat lives, and the first impression always when entering his train room is very, very similar. And it doesn't have to just be the Rockies, which is what he's trying to model, but I think of scenes in upper state New York and others that I'm familiar with, where you have, you know, you go into a valley in real time, in the real world, 1-to-1 scale, and there'll be this sort of this upward thrust of rock precipice with trees, usually conifers, sprinkled around. And then when you look down the valley, it'll be this wall, this panorama of green, more detail up close, and then just kind of blending off into greens. You can't see any of the branch structure. And that's what the impression when I get into Pat's train room, before I even see the town that's in the foreground, before certainly I see even any of the rolling stock, I see the trees and the slopes. So that's that kind of emphasis on the statement that good scenery can make that I think Pat was referencing.
Well, I hope everybody got some information out of this. It's fun doing it. Every time we do it differently. So get more information as we go. So, and thanks, Martin, for giving us the chance to do this.
I'll take the blame.
I love it.
I'm the designated blame taker, so.